Welcome to this special presentation of Investing in Psychedelics, brought to you by the Canadian Securities Exchange in partnership with CFN Media.
All right, we're now live, and this is our second panel today on investing in psychedelics. I'm James Black with the Canadian Securities Exchange, and this is a proud presentation of the CSE and CFN Media. So thank you to everyone who just joined us for panel one. Hopefully you came to this panel and thought you got your money's worth. So without further ado, I am going to introduce your moderator today. It's going to be Anna Sarin, my colleague at the Canadian Securities Exchange, who you probably already know if you're in the last session. Anna, come join the room and let's get the party started.
Thank you, James. That was a wonderful first session. I was super excited. We had, tons of participants, lots of great questions. So if you're joining us from the last session, I really hope that you carry on, with that great dialogue, because it really helps us dive into this as far as we can. Again, my name's Anna Sarin. I'm Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange. This wonderful event has been put together with our partner, CFN Media, so thank you again to them. Our second panel of the day will be investing in psychedelics on a molecular level. This is a little above my head, but I have some fantastic, experts in the field that are joining me today that'll help us dive further into this, and hopefully we can all gain some knowledge, from a scientific perspective. So first, I would love to invite Sher Ali Butt. He is co-founder and CEO of CB Therapeutics. Thank you, Sher, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Anna.
Danny Motyka, he is CEO of Psygen Labs. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Michael Frank, Chairman and CEO of Revive Therapeutics. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Well, I do have to say for anyone that's paying attention, I've had the chance to get to know these guys over the past few weeks, and we've had lots of conversations. You are all so incredibly intelligent that, it's humbling to be in your presence. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to let you all start off by talking about the companies that you're with, the work that you do in the space. So Danny, why don't we start with yourself? Tell us about Psygen Labs.
Thanks so much. So Psygen Labs is basically we're looking to answer the fundamental question of supply for psychedelic drug products. We have a little bit of an R&D focus on some novel compounds that we'd like to develop and some biotech approaches for the future scaling and efficiency of psychedelics, but primarily we're interested in the large-scale manufacture of the classic psychedelics that will be receiving market authorization in the coming years.
Wonderful. Sher, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so we are a biotech based out of San Diego. We are the first company in the world to biosynthesize psilocybin, many of its variants in mushrooms, DMT, many of its variants in yeast, file IP on those. We have a 7,000 square foot facility that does R&D and manufacturing, and we also have a partnership with Cleveland Clinic for clinical trials.
Thank you, Sher. And Michael Frank, tell us about yourself.
Revive predominantly is a pharma IP company. We have a number of licensed and patents and our own patents around cannabis and infectious diseases. We also have some IP that we acquired through the acquisition of a company called Psilocybin Pharma, which is working in the psychedelics area with psilocybin. And right now, we're very active working with the University of Wisconsin with their lab in terms of looking at different formulations on some license we have with Shannon Tittlesden, which are basically shrimp and plant-based additives, which you mix with psilocybin. We believe will have a lot of advantages when taking the drugs. So we're working on a lot of clinical R&D initiatives with University of Wisconsin.
Wonderful, thank you. Michael, not to put you on the spot, but you are glitching a little bit with that headphone. So I'm not sure, last time we had this, you had a different headphone or we did something that fixed it. Give you a chance to do that. So I think I'll start off this conversation while he gets his headphone kind of sorted. Danny, why don't we start it off with you? I'd love to ask in a general term, what kind of research and development is being done in this space? Kind of from a high level, what are you seeing on the most part?
So I guess there's two sides to that. There's the clinical research and development that is really taking, therapeutic protocols that are tying specific drug products to specific indications, mostly for depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorders. And then there's the other side where there's the kind of drug discovery and biotech research. So trying to find novel psychedelics that are maybe have less off-target effects and trying to develop scalable, efficient syntheses in biotech systems.
Sher, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Danny here. One of the things that we all know is that all the classic psychedelics are, off patent, which means that, or in the public domain, which means that you cannot patent these molecules. So there's definitely a big race and a land grab happening right now in the space of creating analogs. So, for example, there are many companies that are looking at not only just being able to patent these molecules, but also being able to develop new characteristics of the molecule. So, for example, with psilocybin, you could take psilocybin as the natural molecule, which normally has a duration of the trip for roughly 4 to 6 hours. With these analogs, you could do something like, for example, take that down to half the time, or maybe have the characteristics go for longer. So there's lots of interest in this space as well.
And Michael, I know that maybe this is something that you could touch on. Is I know that you guys work a lot with universities and different groups that are kind of in the process of these clinical trials. Can you tell us kind of your perspective from that side of things? Oh, I can't hear you at all now. I've messed you all up. Just give you a second there. No, still can't hear you. Maybe just go back to how you had it originally set up. No. Okay, so while he works on that, Danny, maybe what you could touch on is, again, I really want to bring this down to a level that, we can all understand, because obviously none of us are, or most of us aren't scientists that are out here listening. How are these trials being done? Are these trials being done, with patients, or are they just being done with the reaction in labs?
Yeah, so the clinical research, there are several organizations engaged in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. MAPS, I would suggest, is the farthest along in their phase 3 clinical trials with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. Compass Pathways and USONA are both actively engaged in researching psilocybin for depression. And there are several other groups that are basically getting mostly the classical drugs into patients, because there's a long history of use, and so there's significant safety data associated. For the new molecules that are being developed that Sher was kind of alluding to, the challenge there is that there's been no kind of preliminary preclinical data to suggest that they're non-toxic to bring them into the phase 1 safety studies for humans.
Okay, you bring up a good point that I was going to ask you about at some point. Can you tell all of us what is phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of a trial?
So the first phase, once you're past preclinical work, is to just do a small safety study in human trials. Phase 2 would be scaling that up for efficacy on a larger population, somewhere kind of in the order of 25 patients. And then your phase 3 is kind of expanding that even further to multiple sites. You might have upwards of 500 to a couple thousand patients in some studies. And that's really just to demonstrate that your protocols are efficacious across a wide population. And once you have a successful phase 3 clinical trial, you can then use that data set to apply for market authorization from the FDA or from Health Canada.
I think that's it's just an interesting point, because people are getting told, all day long where this trial is at. So it's important to understand what some of those minor terminology, mean when you're looking at your due diligence process. Michael, were we able to get you back online, or have I messed you up completely? You know what I would suggest, Michael? Why don't you log off and log back on, and then we might be able to hear you. And we'll carry on the discussion until you come back on. Sher, why don't you describe to us what is a generation 1 and a generation 2 drug?
Sure. So typically, generation 1 refers to the natural molecules themselves, like psilocybin, psilocin, DMT, MDMA. Generation 2 refers to analogs. So for what we were discussing earlier is, what if we could tweak the molecules that are found in nature and be able to create variants of these molecules that have even better or more desirable properties? So for example, what if we could reduce the trip time from 4 hours to, let's say, 30 minutes? That would be a very desirable effect. Generation 1, again, is the main molecule itself, which again are not patentable, but generation 2 molecules are patentable.
And so would a generation 2 drug be a synthetic, or would that be synthetic psilocybin? Would that be included in generation 2?
So technically, the way I see it is, even though the molecule is synthetic, it's still a Gen 1. The reason being, it's the same molecule. So whether
Okay.
you're getting to the molecule from my perspective, whether you're getting to the molecule from biotech methods, from chemical synthesis methods, or natural extraction methods, the molecule is the molecule. So
Right.
for example, water is water, whether you get it from the ocean or other places, as long as you purify it and standardize it, it's still H2O. So it's the same thing in this case, where it's the same molecule. Now, when you go away from that and you start tweaking parts of the molecule, whether it's the 3D chemistry or the 3D orientation of the atoms themselves, or whether it's adding or subtracting functional groups of that molecule, now that would be a Gen 2 molecule.
And do you feel that there's a lot of work being done in the generation 2 side of things, or are we still focusing on Gen 1?
Absolutely. I think for the majority, I mean, I already have heard about maybe 100 or so clinical trials that are being done on or have been filed with the FDA for psilocybin or MDMA and these Gen 1 molecules. So I think the opportunity window for a lot of these Gen 1 is kind of, already being taken, in my opinion. For Gen 2, there's a land grab happening right now, as I mentioned earlier. I think everybody is trying to use any methodology that they can to create as many of these molecules. And again, because these molecules are patentable, we believe that there's a treasure trove sitting here. Not only are these molecules patentable, that you can just, for example, create these processes, then file the IP on these, and then you can license these molecules to, let's say, another pharma company or other companies that want to take this molecule all the way to final stages and FDA approval. So we definitely think that, generation 2 molecules are going to be the next level. From whatever history has known of what Gen 1 can do, I think generation 2 is going to be sort of a Pandora's box, and we don't really know exactly today what may come out of it.
Do you think that there will be a rush to the Gen 2 development just because, or just for the fact that people will have the ability to patent it and kind of crystallize, the investment side of things?
I believe that's already happening today. There's, aside from ourselves and Danny, there's probably, I would say more than a dozen companies that are already working on this. I think what it's going to come down to ultimately is, how efficiently can you produce a molecule? How many can you produce? So can you produce, let's say, 100 different types of analogs in a given year? Can you produce more than that? What is the cost of production? Is it all CGMP? So I think these are the sorts of things that are going to be highlighted coming forward in the future.
And do you think do you think it's at this stage a bit of a land grab for that type of patenting opportunity?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the companies that I know of, including everybody here on the panel, I believe everybody's trying to find new variants of these, trying to make crystalline structures of the molecules, and then file the patent on these. We may not necessarily use these molecules right away. Certainly, a lot of us have partnerships with clinics or universities for clinical trials. I doubt that any single company, let's say, that's developing 100 molecules a year is going to be able to capitalize on every single molecule, because obviously the cost of taking each single molecule through each of the phases is enormous. So I think the strategy here is, get as many molecules, generate libraries of them, and then you have that big IP portfolio that you can, whether you develop it in-house, whether you develop it with a partner, or completely license it to somebody else, there's a lot of opportunity in the space.
That's super interesting. I never knew that side of it. Michael, do we have you back online?
Do you hear me now?
I hear you now. I'm sorry, and it's my fault. I screwed you up there. I'm so glad that you hopped online now. Right. That's it actually is perfect timing. I'd love for you to get into a little bit. I know you work with lots of groups that are doing, right, clinical studies within various groups. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. You hear me now? Everything's okay?
I can. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry about all that. I don't know. I guess when I came back in, it worked. Apologies to everyone. So predominantly, as I mentioned, Revive is an IP portfolio patent company. We've done a lot of work with certain universities in developing and licensing IP. As far as psilocybin is concerned, we have a strong background working with the University of Wisconsin, Madison campus. We worked with their delivery systems for CBD to look at autoimmune hepatitis and ischemia. The company's got the FDA orphan drug designation status with those protocols. And when I came into the company back in December, we started to look at more effectively different compounds, different areas that can complement what we're doing in the pharma sector. We acquired Psilocin Pharma, who's actually a presenter later on today. And Psilocin had some formulations to put together, which we then filed provisional patents on. And we're working right now with University of Wisconsin, really twofold, in the lab there to work at their delivery systems, which are based on tannin, chitosan, which are shrimp and plant-based formulations. We believe when mixed with psilocybin, it will deliver a very unique onset capabilities, a better experience for people taking it, and different ways that we can create foams and oral dosages. And we're going to be doing clinical trials there, as well as fabrication of product. Secondly, we recently announced the company's got a transaction happening with the School of Pharmacy as part of the University of Wisconsin. We're going to be doing a phase 1 study there with psilocybin on an undisclosed addiction disorder, which you'll hear more about in the coming weeks. But that is with the School of Pharmacy and the groups there. And these groups work quite closely with people like Hefter, Usona, people they procure psilocybin from. So we're very active on the R&D side, and that's where we believe the credibility comes from, is working with the partners from the university.
Well, and that's what I wanted to dive into with you is, obviously you guys have, a large pool of different projects that you're working on with different groups. How capitally intensive is it to go through these clinical trials, and how long can these trials take? Right.
I mean, obviously it takes time to move down the clinical path. Revive's strength really is that it's got a lot of experience working clinically. It's a small company, but it's got that strength. It's worked with the FDA. On top of it, I should add the company is also submitting its IND for a phase 3 clinical trial for the use of basilamine, a drug which we repurposed for the treatment of infectious diseases, predominantly corona. We're submitting that for phase 3 right now, so that's very monumental for us. But as far as moving it down the path, everything is quite capital intensive. The company raised some money recently. It's got warrant money coming in, so we believe we have enough capital to get it going through the line, and then eventually we'll look to raise potentially more capital down the road, or partnerships with other companies. But obviously phase 3, 2, expensive propositions. I know there was a little bit discussion on how we progress through the phases, but phase 2 is important. Obviously, look at safety, efficacy, dosages. On a phase 3 trial, it's much bigger. You're looking for a much bigger sample of people, up to about 800 people, and you really get into much more intensive work there. But when you have a good team of CROs and people helping you with packaging and moving it forward down the pike, it basically is an important aspect in terms of understanding all the protocols and dosages and putting it together. But capital is important, no matter what stage you're at.
Well, and I think, obviously these are more speculative plays, but the opportunity there is that if you structure yourself and you do go public, you've kind of created your platform to go back to market and raise capital when you need to. So if you enter the next phase of your trial, you just go back to market. Your first investors typically in something like that, if you get to the next phase, will probably support you in the next financing. So I think the business model for some of these companies to go public, it really does make a lot of sense. Maybe Danny and Sher, you could touch on, I'll start with you, Danny. There's obviously a huge amount of, historical data on psychedelics, their applicable uses and different trials that have happened. We know that there was stuff done in the 60s and the 70s. How does that kind of data help us as we, revisit these things today?
So the biggest way that they help us is basically being able to use that data to jump directly into a phase 2 clinical trial with the classic psychedelics. So, I would suggest that MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, potentially DMT, there's enough data out there on humans that we will be able to just jump right in and bypass the preclinical and the phase 1 studies. The caveat to that is the challenge with the second generation psychedelics, which is then going to kind of require all of that additional capital in order to first go through the selection criteria of, which of your several candidates is going to be a promising drug. And then you have to take the kind of short list and pay for the remainder of the studies.
Well, and I guess that, one question that brings up for me is, does, getting a generation 2 drug out of it, we don't necessarily know if it has any value. So just creating the new compound doesn't necessarily, kind of like technology, you can create the technology, but does it have any place in in our lives today, really will become the question, right? Sher, it's so interesting what you guys do in your lab. Maybe you can explain to us in a way that we can all understand what it is that you guys do in your lab.
Sure. Yeah, so we are a biotech and a synthetic biology company. Primarily, what we do is we genetically engineer yeast. We use yeast as an organism of choice because it's the most studied and it's the most scalable and it's the cheapest cost of production for any organism for biotech on the planet. Human beings have been using yeast for making beer for, 10, 15,000 years. So there's that history, there's that scalability, and there's that non-toxicity that comes with using yeast versus something like E. coli. So typically what we do is we genetically engineer different strains of yeast. We started the company in 2016. So we're one of the first companies in the world to scale up cannabinoids, 13 different cannabinoids to the level of a 400-liter bioreactor. We're certainly looking at taking it to a bigger scale. In fact, last week we sent out our first shipment of cannabinoids to a customer. So we started generating revenue as of last week. And then
That's
from there,
wonderful.
we got into psychedelics about a year and a half ago. I have used psilocybin for personally as well, which is kind of what got me interested in psilocybin and DMT and these molecules. I definitely saw a huge potential. So now what we're doing is, we've changed the business model from just being a cannabinoids company focused on cannabinoids to focusing on all therapeutic molecules. So anything that has therapeutic value, anything that's very expensive, we can re-engineer in yeast. And that's sort of the journey that we took. So we ended up becoming, like I said, the first company in the world to make psilocybin in yeast, file IP on it. The same thing with DMT. And now we're going through the list of looking at other molecules that are known to be very valuable. Again, we haven't disclosed any of those molecules today. Typically, what we do is we file IP first, get the expression of the molecule, get the data, and then we are able to disclose what that is. But in a nutshell, that's what CB Therapeutics does. We have 2 patents granted. We have 12 more pending. And again, we're very excited about our partnership with the Cleveland Clinic. They're definitely interested in a lot of these Gen 1 and Gen 2 molecules, and they want to take these to the next level.
And so one thing that we had talked about last time we were chatting was you actually talked about the cost difference of using this process.
Absolutely.
Do you mind touching on that?
Absolutely. So from what I've from the research that I've done, there's 3 ways to make. We'll just take psilocybin as a case example. So the first way is extraction from the mushrooms itself. Mushrooms typically contain about 0.6% psilocybin. When you do the extraction from the mushrooms itself, it comes out to about $100,000 roughly per kilogram. And again, this is just in average rough cost. Again, with people that have a bigger grower scale, it would be different. The second way to do it is chemical synthesis. So companies like Compass Pathways, I believe they're using chemically synthesized psilocybin. I've heard the range from anywhere between $300,000 to $500,000 per kilogram. And the reason why we decided to go with biotech is the cost difference is enormous. So we're already looking at about less than $5,000 a kilogram. That's already you could say we're between a 20 to 100x cost reduction, and it's going to be the same level, same quality, same purity. So I think from that perspective, and given the fact that our whole team had that background in biotech, we have some people that have been working in the industry for over 30 years. We have a team of about 19 people currently. So given all these things, we decided to move ahead on the biotech direction.
Well, I think, I had an interesting, the first panel that we had today was with a group from capital markets, varying groups in the capital markets. And one thing that we talked about was how to evaluate these companies. I think it's trials like that we might see come to market because you can actually, create a strong valuation of what the benefit of that is, what the reward is,
Sure.
And what the potential is, right? Now, obviously, it's in the title, but maybe you can just describe to us what is synthetic psilocybin and why is it being created?
So synthetic psilocybin, typically anything synthetic when people talk about it is referring, in my opinion, again, more towards the chemical synthesis made products. So chemical synthesis is where you take a bunch of different chemicals, you do organic chemistry methods on it, and you're able to create these. The problem typically, and this is obviously not the case with everybody doing it, but typically the generational problem with chemical synthesis is that typically it's more expensive and it's harder to control the types of final molecules that are made. So to give you a very easy example is, you have your left hand and your right hand, both of them are the same, but you can't put a right hand glove on the left hand. And the same goes for molecules and how they bind to receptors in some cases, where the 3D chemistry is different. So that's been the typical problem with chemical synthesis. I know that they've been able to overcome a lot of these issues over the years, but that's one of the big reasons why people switched over to biotech. With biotech, what we usually do with synthetic biology is we take the same machinery that's inside the organism. So, for example, the enzyme inside the mushroom that creates the actual molecule itself, psilocybin. So we take that exact machinery, we just put it in a more efficient organism like yeast, for example. So when the final product is made, it's the exact same molecule. So you don't have to worry about fitting, one of the gloves on the other side because it's the exact same thing.
Well, hopefully you're more successful than the sourdough starter that I've been working on for the past 6 weeks.
Thank you.
Danny, why don't you talk to us? And I think, again, we can't have this conversation without touching a little bit on the cannabis sector and the research and development done on that space and how it's coming to this space. One thing that you talked about, was these special access programs and the differences between those two sides. Do you mind touching on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the advent of the cannabis market was really created through the expanded special access program, where there were a series of court cases in Canada that ruled in favor of patients having access to medical cannabis. There is unfortunately a line in the Canadian drugs and substance food and drugs regulations that prevents psychedelics, all Part J drugs, which includes all the psychedelics, from being eligible for the special access program. So because of that, the only route to bring psychedelics to market in Canada is through the clinical trial pathway and through the drug development pathway. But there is a special access program in other countries. And basically what the special access program is it's a method for physicians to approve a medication to be used for a specific indication outside of the traditional DIN pathway. So typically when a drug is approved for market, it has a drug identification number that's provided to it. And the special access program allows you to be able to use a compound that does not have an associated DIN number. So there's, for example, in Australia, there's a special access program that would allow MDMA or psilocybin to be prescribed to patients. In the United States, I believe the FDA has approved a special access program for MDMA for post-traumatic stress for a specific subset of veterans. And in Canada, unfortunately, right now, that isn't a possibility. So to get psychedelics to market, we need to have successful clinical trials, or we need to have a court case that will basically overrule that and create a special access program.
Right.
That's very interesting. You're all, somewhat or mostly based on the psilocybin side of things. Is there lots of research and development that's happening in the ketamine space, LSD space, MDMA?
I mean, I could, address that. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we're working with, psilocybin specifically on the lab setting with the University of Wisconsin. Obviously, as I mentioned, they have a setup there. They have a DEA narcotics license that can do the work. Other companies in the space are working with ketamine. Some are working with LSD, doing some clinical work in Europe. People like Mind Medicine, and obviously Champignon Brands is working with ketamine. But everybody's looking at different areas, and I think the clinical end of it is really the way that supports the thesis right now, because it's so early in the game, and it gives you the credibility in the marketplace.
Yeah,
Right.
I completely agree. And to add to that, I think one of the big differences between cannabis and psychedelics is the fact that cannabis has predominantly been on the recreational market focus, whereas psychedelics, I think, will be focused more on the R&D, more on the clinical trials. And our focus is not just psilocybin. So I think with the biotech platform that we've created, we can rapidly develop new molecules. So we definitely have our eyes on, I would say, probably 5 to 10 other molecules as well that we're looking at that have a lot of potential, that have seen a lot of potential, and there's a lot of buzz around them that we think would be good candidates to develop. So in the coming months, you will be hearing about different molecules. So the way we look at it is we want to look across the spectrum and find any molecules that we think are valuable, and then we can reverse engineer those into the yeast.
Right, Danny?
The only thing that I would add is that something that kind of, separates Psygen from the rest is that we are actively developing through access to a dealer's license. We're in partnership with the University of Alberta. We have access to manufacture 6 psychedelics: MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline, and 2CB. And the reason that we have all those drugs on the amended dealer's license is because we received letters of interest from researchers around the world. I think we have 17 endorsement letters who are basically actively looking to do clinical research with those compounds. So where, psilocybin definitely seems to be the focus right now. MDMA is likely to be the first market authorized psychedelic. which, MAPS really deserves a big shout out. They've done incredible work over the last 30 years as a nonprofit to be able to do this. But there's absolutely a lot of interest in LSD and DMT, and less so mescaline. The duration is quite long to be taken into a clinical setting, but there are some groups who are interested in that. And the only thing about 2CB is that there is no safety data associated, so that one would be quite expensive to bring to market. But it is very promising from the early research that was done on it.
Right. Now, all three of you have a fairly large background on the cannabis side of things, and now you've all kind of switched over to looking at this. Is there something what are the main differences or similarities that you find from both sides of things? Maybe Michael, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, what we did as a company is we believed that pharma was going to, within the cannabis sector, was going to be sort of the next wave, and we did a lot of work with the University of South Carolina, where we basically procured some licenses that took CBD and basically looked at it in a setting to treat autoimmune hepatitis. And as I mentioned, we got orphan drug designation on those protocols. So our work was based on the fact that we believe that, cannabis sector will still thrive and pharma is going to be part of it. And we were able to, from our perspective, just transcend that work, specifically on the delivery mechanism from the University of Wisconsin into psilocybin. So for us, it was more to looking at optimizing our assets, seeing how we can maximize the value of them, and seeing where the technology and the chemistry will work. And we believe that it does. So that's how we made our transition and into the sector and sort of took it from the cannabis side. I should mention also on some of Sher's comments, obviously, we're going to be, purchasing psilocybin. Definitely interested in looking at cost advantages. We talked a bit about that yesterday on yeast-based derivative. So obviously, we're all learning in this industry, and when you have some type of framework to work from, I think it helps, move forward. And that's been sort of what Revive's about, is sort of maximizing its IP that it has and leveraging it into new markets.
Wonderful. And actually, I will take this opportunity to jump into some of the Q&A that's come in, because it's just on this topic. Danny, a question's come in that said, can you expand on the statement that cannabis focus has been mostly on the recreational side? Medical has been the driver, and there is still limited research on many of the hundreds of cannabinoids. Excuse me.
Yeah, so I guess just the big thing is that cannabis evolved through the special access program when there was really a limited number of clinical trials that were demonstrating efficacy. There was a lot more anecdotal evidence, substantial anecdotal evidence, and cannabis evolved into a consumer packaged goods industry more so than it evolved into a purely medical industry. So it started out as a medical access program and evolved into this recreational CPG market, whereas psychedelics are basically going directly through the medicalization pathway. And I think it's going to be a long time before we start to see even the possibility for a CPG psychedelics market, maybe with microdosing, but even that remains to be seen. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Well, it answered my question, but
Okay.
Sher, do you want to maybe touch a little bit on, you did a switch as well from cannabis to the psychedelic side. Do you have any comments on that one?
Sure. So, I mean, I would see it more as, the expansion of what we've done. So, with cannabinoids, for example, we got it to a point where we've scaled it up. Now the next thing to do is to start manufacturing and then continue that manufacturing, continue making more revenue, scaling that up further with the potential customers. From our end, the way we see it is we need, our strain engineers and people in the lab, they need new molecules to work on. So, while the manufacturing is going, the manufacturing has its own side. It's got its own people taking care of that. On the other side, we need new molecules. I think one of the things that you realize, like being in synthetic biology, is that, or any company, I would imagine for that matter, is to stay on top of things. You need to always be innovative. So we always try to, to look out for different things. The way that I look at going from the focus shifted for us definitely from going from cannabis to psychedelics, because A, there was huge market interest, and B, we're definitely big believers in the power of what psychedelics can do. I mean, look at what cannabis can do. Definitely, there's a lot of things cannabis can do, such as CBD. There's new molecules coming out like THCV. We're making CBG, CBC, and a bunch of other molecules. But I think the potential of what psychedelics can address, especially under a clinical setting, is huge. And I think for somebody that has used psychedelics before for my own purposes in the past, I think that potential definitely signals a lot more interest from our team as well, and the investors and people at large. So we're very excited about jumping into this new side where you can go into many different molecules. You don't have to worry about just the Gen 1, but you can also work on Gen 2 molecules, which creates additional value for investors and us.
Absolutely. One question that came in, I'll let any of you jump in here. If a drug is approved by the FDA in the US, does Canada's equivalent agency recognize it, or is there a completely separate process and separate trials they have to go through? Anyone?
Well, usually you have to go through another process with Health Canada to do clinical work. But obviously, when you're leading up to the drug level, you could do a sort of a multinational study in the U.S. and in Canada. That's possible, but usually you have to go through Health Canada approval.
Right. Another question that came in, will there be an integration of DNA, RNA sequencing with regards to diagnosing conditions in order to develop or select therapeutic options?
Yeah, I believe there's going to be a lot of, because the industry is brand new, there's not a lot happening. And because of the way that technology, diagnostic technology, biotech technology, and these things are moving, I think definitely there's going to be not only an integration of these technologies, but also things like bioinformatics is going to be a huge push. Anything that can push your automation, any type of manufacturing or R&D automation is going to be huge in the future. So those are the kinds of things that we think will create a lot of value for people, is any type of automation in this industry, any type of new technologies, or being able to use bioinformatics or other types of platforms that accelerate your research will have huge value in the future.
Absolutely. One final question for all of you before we log off. I can't thank you guys enough. I think that you really broke down, some important elements of this sector as we start to look at it. So hopefully we're all a little bit more intelligent after this. I know I am. One question for all of you is how do you think the big pharmas are going to handle this sector? Are they coming at this full force? Are they waiting for the little guys to develop the drugs and then, consolidate and do a roll up? How do you see this playing out with them? Danny, why don't we start with you?
So my impression is that we've seen big pharma kind of enter the psychedelic space with Johnson & Johnson and their esketamine. One of the psychedelics it's really a new paradigm in medicine, though, because most of the capital that is going to be associated with these psychedelic therapies will be at the level of the treatment center. There's, you have an MDMA experience that lasts for 6 to 8 hours, and you need to have 2 therapists guiding someone for that entire time. So your drug cost for the session might be $100 US, but then you have 2 therapists at $150 an hour for 8 hours. I just don't know that big pharma is going to see the same kind of profit model. And so my impression is that they might get involved, but I don't anticipate seeing a lot of participation, maybe in the second gen psychedelics, because if you can remove the psychedelic action and you could create a take-home medication, I could see big pharma getting interested in that. But I'm not sure that they'd be interested in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy that is really the focus of the industry right now.
Yeah, it's so early in the game. Obviously, I think that got to go through a lot of clinical work to get validation from the pharma. So that's the first step. And the groups that are working with universities and lead doctors, hospitals, I think will attract over time some of the big pharma. But it's early in the game, so it is possible. But right now we got to obviously work through that process, I think, clinically.
Wonderful. Sher, do you have just a quick last thought there?
Yeah, so I think so. Compared to cannabis, I think there's going to be more interest from pharma, in my opinion. The reason being is, the psychedelic space is a lot more R&D and clinical settings focused than cannabis ever was or has been traditionally. So I think for that reason alone, and the fact that there exists huge market potential like PTSD, depression, etc., for these molecules. So I think in the future, once some of these companies, our companies and others, become more established, they have more data, I think big pharma is likely to take more of a notice than the traditional cannabis sector.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much
Thank
for
you for
your
having us.
insights.
Thank you.
This will be posted to our YouTube page. Thank you everyone for participating. I'll go to you now, James.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
Another wonderful job. That's 2 out of 6 now. So everyone, if you're watching today, you do realize there's 4 more sessions left. We're not done. Next session is going to come up on a link on the bottom of your screen to the right. It's going to be a session called Therapeutic Applications of Psychedelics. Lots of great speakers on that one as well. Thank you, Anna. Great job. Thank you, panelists. And again, I'll send you the link. And don't forget to subscribe at CSE TV on YouTube. That's our channel. It's going to have all the replay, and I'll make my best effort to make sure everyone's contact information from today's session will be in those video notes. So send a link now to that session. And that's it. We'll see you on the next one, everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next panel 3.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.